Everyone's talking about it.
We're talking about inflation. Good evening and thank you for joining us. I'm Mitch Carr.
An inflation rate of 10.9%.
Sky-high inflation
and persistent inflation.
Food inflation in the Eurozone.
Fighting inflation appears to be the immediate battle.
The inflation, it is crushing hardworking families.
Here to refute some of the most common myths around that dirty word. You know him, you love him. Learn Liberty welcomes back.
I'm Antony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of the podcast Words and Numbers.
Myth 1. The price of this thing I buy went up. That's inflation.
This is a common misconception. People see the price of something go up. The price of milk goes up, the price of gas goes up, and people say, well, that's inflation. And it's not inflation. Inflation is a rise in the average price level. So during periods of inflation, it's possible that some prices are rising. It's also possible that some prices are falling. For example, from 2013 through 2020, the average price of air travel fell almost 3% per year at the same time that inflation was averaging 2% per year. So we had average prices going up, but this specific price going down. So we can't say anything about inflation by looking at a single price.
Myth 2. Inflation is caused by corporate greed.
Yeah, that's very interesting because here's the thing. From 1980 through 2020, inflation averaged less than 3% a year. But throughout 2021, inflation jumped to about 8%. So if indeed inflation is caused by corporate greed, then all of a sudden in 2020, corporations discovered that they could be greedy, and they started raising prices. This is clearly not the case. If corporations are greedy, they were greedy in periods of inflation. They're also greedy in periods of deflation. Inflation arises when the money supply grows faster than the production of goods and services. It has nothing to do with greed on the part of the corporations or anybody else. Even an economy comprised entirely of saints will experience inflation if the money supply grows faster than the economy.
Myth 3. The president is responsible for inflation.
Yeah, people like to point to individuals to blame. The presidents aren't responsible for inflation. There's little they can do to cause it. There's little they can do to fix it. The current bout of inflation we're experiencing was due to money printing, which was caused by deficits, which in turn were caused by politicians spending more money than they bring in. If we're to look to a root cause, the root cause is the printing of the money to fund the federal deficit. And that brings into question now who's responsible for the federal deficit. Well, the federal budget is an animal created by the House, the Senate, and the President combined. Those three groups together are responsible for the deficits which are being funded by the money printing, which in turn is causing the inflation. In 2020, the money supply growth tripled compared to what was happening prior to 2020. This is due largely to the fact that the federal government undertook stimulus spending. The federal government spent several $1 trillion more in 2020 than it typically does. In total, this contributed to the federal debt rising about 30%, a total of $7 trillion from 2020 to the present.
Myth 3.5. The Russian president is responsible for inflation.
Yeah, and notice the theme here. The theme is to blame anybody we can get our hands on. The fault is the US president, the fault is the corporations who are greedy, the fault is the Russian president. Politicians like to cast blame in all of these directions because it puts the blame somewhere other than where it really belongs, which is the Federal Reserve printing money to fund the deficits. Is Vladimir Putin responsible for the inflation? No, he is responsible for an increase in the price of oil. 5% of the oil the world consumes comes from Russia. Anytime you have a war, this creates uncertainty. Now combine the war in Ukraine, which is causing uncertainty, with the fact that one of the major players, Russia, is a major oil exporter. Oh, and also a nuclear power. You put all of these pieces together and all of a sudden this creates tremendous uncertainty in oil markets. That's going to drive the price of oil up. That in turn is going to drive the price of gas up. And it's going to drive up prices of all sorts of goods and services that rely on oil and gas for their production and transport. Is this inflation? No, it's not. It's the rise in specific prices, not the rise in the average price level.
Myth 3.5.5. The Democrats or Republicans are responsible for inflation.
Yeah, and again, we're casting blame, right? So if it's not the US president, and it's not Putin, and it's not the greedy corporations, it must be the Democrats or the Republicans or whoever it is that we're casting blame at. And the fact is, we can go back historically and compare which party has controlled the White House to inflation. And what you find going back to 1947, inflation averages 3.5% when Democrats control the White House. And when Republicans control the White House, inflation averages 3.5%. Now, someone might say in response, okay, but you're looking back to 1947. What about in more recent years? Well, since the 1990s, inflation has averaged about 2.3%, regardless, again, of which party is in the White House. Doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans. So parties are not to blame any more than presidents or greedy corporations or Putin.
Myth 4. Increasing the minimum wage causes inflation.
Increasing the minimum wage increases some prices. It increases the prices of goods that intensively use minimum wage labor. That's not inflation, it's the rise in the price of a specific good. But even there, depending on how we're raising the minimum wage, we may not see much of an effect. For example, about 1% of US workers earn the federal minimum wage. So raising the federal minimum wage, even by a relatively large amount, is not going to have much of an effect on prices.
Myth 5. Inflation is good, or inflation is bad.
Here's the interesting thing. It doesn't matter whether you have lots of inflation or a little bit of inflation. What matters is whether the inflation is expected or unexpected. If the inflation is expected, everybody knows we're going to have 10% inflation, and it's going to be 10% inflation solidly for the foreseeable future. Well, what happens? Everybody builds that into their calculations. So if you're a landlord renting an apartment, you automatically build a 10% increase in rent into the rental contract. If you're a worker looking for a job, you demand an automatic 10% raise every year to compensate for inflation. If you're a bank loaning money, you automatically add on 10% to the interest rate to compensate for inflation. So long as everybody is expecting the inflation, they build it into their decision making and nothing changes. The problem is when the inflation is unexpected. When the inflation is unexpected, now all of a sudden people find themselves having locked into a labor contract that allows for 2% inflation, but suddenly inflation is 5%. And now the workers are losing money, they're losing purchasing power. Or you're a landlord and you've locked your renters into an annual increase of 2% and inflation is 5%, and now the landlord is getting less money in inflation-adjusted terms. So the problem is the unexpected inflation. Now, people will also say that deflation is a problem because when there's deflation, people will tend not to spend their money. So I don't spend because I'm waiting, I'm anticipating that prices are going to be lower in the future. And there's something to be said for that, except for an interesting example that we have. And the interesting example is the computer industry. Adjusted for quality, prices of computers and computer-related technology have been falling dramatically for decades now. And yet we don't see that phenomenon. People go ahead, they buy computers, they buy new smartphones, knowing that if they waited 6 months or a year, those things would be cheaper. And yet they buy anyway. And so what's the answer here? The answer is, to the extent that deflation is a problem, it's not deflation itself. It's the transition from a period of inflation to a period of deflation. That is, it's when the deflation is unexpected that you get problems. There is one important way in which inflation, whether it's anticipated or not, is bad, and that is inflation eats away at the purchasing power of people's dollars. So if I hold my wealth in the form of cash, I have $100 in the bank, inflation comes along, it's going to eat away the purchasing power of those dollars. Now, if I have my money invested in a stock market or into real estate where the prices of those things are rising with inflation, I'm somewhat protected. The problem is if I'm holding actual dollars themselves, inflation eats away the purchasing power. And this is where the phrase comes from. People say inflation is a tax on savings. As the Federal Reserve prints more money and this causes inflation, what's really happening is the Federal Reserve is stealing the purchasing power of the dollars I'm holding. And that purchasing power is going into these new dollars that the Federal Reserve is printing.
Myth 6. We understand what's happening in real time.
And this is the interesting thing, because we only know about inflation in retrospect. We have economists and analysts that go out and they look at prices of things and they bring this information back, they process it, and in analyzing it, we can come to the realization that yes, we're dealing with a period of inflation. But here's the problem. Often it takes months for that to happen. It takes months for the data to be collected, to be organized properly, to be analyzed. And by the time we determine that indeed we're in a period of inflation, the inflation is already several months old. So if along comes the Federal Reserve that decides, all right, we need to do something about inflation, what are we going to do? And the Federal Reserve decides we're going to cut back on the money supply to quell the inflation. By the time the Federal Reserve comes to that decision, by the time it enacts that decision, the inflation may have naturally corrected itself. And so all of a sudden, we're now in a period where the Federal Reserve is unintentionally doing the opposite of what it should be doing, contracting the money supply during deflationary periods and increasing it during inflationary periods. All of this caused by that time lag of us not being aware that inflation is present until several months after it begins.
Myth 7. Government can or should control inflation by printing money or establishing price controls.
The time lag is the major problem. And if you want a very good analogy, trying to control inflation through monetary policy, increasing and decreasing the money supply, is very much like trying to drive down the road, except that your windscreen has been removed and in its place is put a television screen with a camera mounted on the front of your car. And the camera shows you on the television screen everything you would see if indeed you had a windscreen in front of you. Except there's a 10-second delay. So what's displayed on the screen is information that's 10 seconds old. Now imagine trying to drive like that in traffic. You look at the screen, it looks like the road is clear, so you step on the gas, but it actually isn't because cars have come to a stop and you run into the car in front of you. Or it looks like there's lots of traffic, so you come to a screeching halt, but actually that was 10 seconds ago. The traffic's now moved on, now people run into you. This is exactly the lag problem we have. It's the major problem of the government through the Federal Reserve attempting to control inflation. And so what's the right solution? The best solution is to admit that we aren't good at this and to hold the money supply at some constant level. Milton Friedman advised that we grow the money supply at the same rate that the economy grows. So if the economy grows 3%, we grow the money supply at 3%. Following a rule like that takes the decision-making out of the hands of the Federal Reserve. And now we have some stable rule. Is it going to be perfect? No, it isn't. But on average, it will be better than the problems you have when humans try to intervene and anticipate what's going on, combined with all of these lags. Let me add.
Myth, what number is this? Let's call it 7.5. Dollars and gold have intrinsic value.
And this is where the brilliance of a gold standard comes in. People make a mistake in thinking that the importance of a gold standard is that gold has intrinsic value, and we tie the value of the dollar to the value of the gold, and because the gold has intrinsic value, now the dollar has value. That's all nonsense. Gold doesn't have intrinsic value any more than paper dollars have intrinsic value. In fact, nothing has intrinsic value. Something has value because a person wants it. The only reason we think that gold has value is because we imagine that we could hand a chunk of gold to somebody and they'd give us things we want in return. Well, that's exactly why dollars have value, because we believe that we can hand the dollars to somebody and they'll give us something in return. So what makes the gold standard important is not the fact that the gold has some intrinsic value. It's the fact that the quantity of gold is limited. And if you tie your dollars to the gold, you can't print more dollars than the gold you have on hand. And because the gold you have is limited, the dollars you can print are limited. It's the limiting of the printing of the dollars that makes the gold standard so important.
Myth 8. Everything at the supermarket is getting smaller. That's not factored in.
What you're describing is what we call shrinkflation. That is, as you go to buy a hamburger at McDonald's, the price might be the same, but the hamburger itself is smaller. And people say, well, this is really inflation, but we're not measuring it. And that's incorrect. We do measure this. When economists go out and look at prices of things for the purpose of constructing inflation estimates, they look not just at the prices, but at the quantity and the quality of the product. So analysts will actually look at a McDonald's hamburger, take it and weigh it. If they find that the weight has declined by 10%, but the price has remained the same, that's the same as the price of the hamburger going up by 10%. And so that's what feeds into the inflation calculations. And it's not just the quantity of the product, it's also the quality. As computers become faster and better, that contributes to a decline in the effective cost of a computer. So a computer in 2000 would cost $1,500. A computer today would cost $1,500, but the computer today does twice as much as the computer did in 2000. So in effect, the price of the computer has cut in half. And yes, economists do take that into account when they calculate inflation.
Myth 9. Inflation numbers exclude increases in the cost of energy and food.
Yeah, that's incorrect, and that myth comes about because people are unaware that economists maintain an entire suite of inflation calculations. There's overall consumer inflation, which is what's commonly quoted in the media, but economists also maintain inflation measures that exclude energy prices, that exclude healthcare prices. They maintain inflation measures that focus on things that wage earners buy versus things that people in general buy versus things that retirees buy. There's an entire suite of inflation calculations. When you hear quoted the overall consumer inflation rate, that includes the prices of all things that consumers typically buy.
Myth 10. Last one, we promise. Printing money doesn't cause inflation. After all, the Fed printed money when COVID began, but we didn't see inflation until a year later.
That's an interesting case. From the start of COVID, which was roughly February, March of 2020, to July of 2020, so basically roughly 4 months thereafter, or roughly a 4-month period. During that period, the money supply increased by $3 trillion. That is, the Federal Reserve packed into those 4 months the same growth in the money supply that had occurred over the prior 4 years. It's a tremendous amount of money growth packed into a small period of time. And what happened? Prices remained pretty much the same. Inflation from the start of COVID to the end of 2020 was roughly 3%, which is approximately what inflation was prior to COVID. And so people look at that and they say, look, there's got to be a problem here. How can increase in the money supply cause inflation when we just saw a massive increase in the money supply and no change in inflation at all? Notice something interesting that was happening at the same time. During those months, starting in roughly February, March of 2020, we went through the largest economic contraction we have seen since the Great Depression. We had unemployment hitting 14%. We had large swaths of the economy forced out of business as the government shut businesses down. And on top of all of that, there was tremendous uncertainty as to how long any of this would last. Some people predicted a few months, some people predicted several years. And in the midst of all of this tremendous uncertainty and recession, what was the stock market doing? The stock market over that period rose about 20%. Now that doesn't make sense. If we're in an economic crisis, the likes of which have not been seen since the Great Depression, how could it be that the stock market is rising 20% over the course of 2020? The answer lies in the fact that the increase in the money supply that would normally cause inflation did not go into the goods and services markets. It went into financial markets. And so what we saw was not an increase in prices of goods and services, but an increase in prices of stocks and bonds, financial instruments. And prices of financial instruments aren't included in inflation calculations. Inflation only looks at the price of goods and services. So I claim that over this period, inflation was hiding in financial markets. Now, one way we can confirm that that's what was happening is to notice what happened as the fear of COVID subsided. As the fear of COVID subsided and the economy got back to normal, the lockdowns were eliminated and people were comfortable, we weren't going to see a resurgence, that money started to move. It moved out of financial markets and into goods and services markets. And what did you see happening at roughly the same time? You saw a massive increase in inflation from the 3% that we had in 2020 up to the around 8% that we saw in 2021 and is still persisting. And along with that, we saw the stock market level out and then start to decline.
Myth 0? Money matters.
This myth bumps up against something that many people get wrong, and I would call it the core myth of not just inflation, but the core myth of economics. And that is that money matters. And by that, what I mean is not that money is unimportant, but rather money is simply a means to an end. The end is goods and services. The whole reason you work for money is so that you can purchase goods and services. It's the goods and services that matter. And what happened in COVID? We had a lockdown. We prevented people from producing goods and services. And the Federal Reserve comes in and prints a bunch of money, which the government then spends in the form of these quantitative easings. And people see all of these dollars floating around and they think, okay, life is going to be good because we have dollars. But that's the myth. It's not the dollars that matter, it's the goods and services that matter.
Myth 11. The Fed had to do something to combat COVID. Hey, if the Fed can promise something and make everybody base their decisions on it and then just keep going anyway, so can we.
It's a psychological trick. Now, as with any psychological trick, it's short term. The Fed could get away with it for a few months, maybe a year. But after that, people start to realize, as we're realizing now, wait a moment, printing dollars really doesn't do anything real. All it does is create inflation, and we have the same goods and services problem we had before. But thankfully, a year's gone by, and now the lockdowns are gone, and we can get back to producing goods and services. So as a short-term fix, as a short-term psychological, not economic fix, it might have been a decent idea, but it's not something that's going to work long-term.
Myth 12. The government can fight inflation by raising taxes.
This is the premise of modern monetary theory, that we can print as much money as we want, and if we get inflation, the government can tax the excess money back out of the economy. So you have the Federal Reserve on the one hand printing money to fund federal spending, and as we get inflation, on the other hand, we have the government raising taxes to pull the excess money out of the economy to bring prices back down and remain stable. The problem with this argument is that it's a bait and switch, because what it suggests is that we can perform this function and everything will remain the same, we'll have stable prices, we'll have the same GDP, everything's fine. Except the nature of our GDP has changed. When the Fed prints money and the government uses that money to buy things the government wants, and the government raises taxes to siphon money out of the economy, what's happening is government spending is rising due to this Fed printing, but on the other hand, consumer spending is falling due to these taxes. So what we've really done is we've changed the nature of our GDP away from goods and services that consumers want toward goods and services that politicians and bureaucrats want. So we might still have $10 billion worth of construction, but it'll be construction of border walls, not apartment buildings. or we'll have $5 billion worth of spending on hand grenades instead of $5 billion worth of spending on avocados. We get more goods and services government wants, less goods and services that consumers want. And on top of all of that, there's an additional problem. And that is, historically, any time Congress has gotten hold of more dollars, it's spent them. On average, every time government revenues rise by $1, Congress the following year increases spending by $1.20. So if indeed we followed this modern monetary theory recipe of the Federal Reserve printing money and government taxing that excess money back out of the economy, what likely would happen is that Congress would turn around and push that money right back into the economy as it increased its spending in the subsequent fiscal year.
Bonus myth. You can dance to bebop music. Trust us, it's related.
There's all sorts of unintended consequences that will arise depending on who you tax and how much you tax them. One interesting example of this is in the United States, the rise of bebop music back in the 1930s or thereabouts. This is a style of music to which people can't dance. The beat is off, it's similar to jazz. This arose in part, not fully, but in part, by a tax that the government placed on establishments that served food and drink and had dancing. Prior to this tax, it was popular for people to go out to a restaurant or a bar or whatnot, and there is a band there that plays music and people dance to the music. The government saw this, Congress saw this and started taxing it, and the tax was rather large, as I recall. And what happened? Well, establishments still wanted music for their customers, but they needed music that customers weren't going to dance to so that they could get around this tax. And this encouraged the evolution of a style of music to which you can't dance. It's an unintended consequence of taxation. Now take that small example, and it is a small example, but multiply it by 300 million varied people who work in varied industries and have varied investments or savings or borrowings or whatever it is, and all of a sudden you can see that any particular change in the tax code the government makes is going to have a domino effect of unintended consequences. You find all kinds of interesting examples like that. One in particular that's happening right now in this country, you will hear politicians say things like the middle class worker's wage is stagnated, hasn't risen in 20, 30 years. And that's actually incorrect. Middle class wages have risen about 6% more than inflation since the early 1980s. But still, a 6% more than inflation, that's 6%, that's not 6% a year, that's 6% total since 1980. That's not that much. But what has happened is that compensation, the combination of wages and employer-paid benefits, has risen 50% more than inflation. What's been happening since 1980 is that as workers receive raises for their work, those raises have not been going into actual wages. They've been going into employer contributions to health insurance, to retirement funds, all sorts of things that employers would pay for. The reason is the tax code, because employer contributions to health insurance, to retirement portfolios are largely untaxed, whereas wages are taxed. So both the employer and the worker are better off when the employer gives the worker a raise in the form of employer-paid benefits rather than in the form of wages. It's an unintended consequence of the way we tax income.
Myth? No, just kidding. That's really it. That's 10 myths debunked before factoring for inflation.